I've pinned the most chilling and terrifying stories I've ever heard on this map. Today I'll share one of them with you. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling my head throb with relentless pain. The cause was the screams, long filled with pain and terror. At first I thought it was the usual noise from the party that always happened in our yard, but this time something was different. The sounds were not like the usual drunken clamor or laughter I had grown accustomed to. The screams were piercing, so eerie that they made me freeze in bed, not daring to move. It felt as if fear itself had crept into the room, enveloping me with invisible tentacles. I could hear the horrifying scream echoing through the neighboring walls, each wave of sound piercing me to the bone. It seemed as if it wasn't just a person screaming, but as if death itself had come and started collecting its victims. Only when absolute silence reigned in my room did I gather the courage to look out the window. What I saw made my heart stop. The courtyard was strewn with the bodies of the friends of the neighbor who lived below my apartment. Their lifeless bodies lay in strange poses, as if they had been brutally thrown to the ground. The street was bathed in the dim light of street lamps, but even under it, the terrible scene was visible. A multitude of bodies motionless, with glassy eyes staring into nowhere. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, and my body began to tremble from shock. Suddenly I saw the courtyard flooded with the bright signal lights of police cars. Their light blinded me, as if thunderbolts had struck the very ground. I recoiled, taking a step back, and nearly fell. My heart was pounding wildly, and my mind couldn't comprehend what I had seen. Something terrible had happened that night, and I knew I would no longer be able to close my eyes without seeing this horrifying scene before me. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The feeling that reality had become unusually fragile wouldn't leave me. Only one desire gnawed at me from within, to find out what had happened in the yard. I carefully opened the door and saw Gabriella, the neighbor from the apartment to the left. She had also come out, trembling all over. Her eyes shone with fear, and she clutched the small shoulders of her children, as if trying to shield them from the world. Gabriella whispered a few words into their ears, sending them back inside the apartment and quickly closing the door behind them. Our eyes met. In hers, I saw not just fear. It was pure, unbearable terror, the same I had felt when I saw those scattered bodies. Tears glistened on her lashes, and I felt deep sorrow for her and for all of us. Silently, gently, I squeezed her shoulder in a supportive gesture, and she barely nodded in response, as if thanking me for understanding. We began to descend the stairs, each step echoing in the ominous silence. Gabriella followed me, as if seeking protection in my shadow. I tried to keep myself together, but I felt my legs turning to jelly, and my heart pounded in my chest as if it wanted to burst out. When we stepped onto the cold stone of the yard, a sharp chill ran through my legs. Only then did I realize that in my shock and fear, I had forgotten to put on shoes. At that moment, an ambulance arrived following the police. The lights flashed in the dim morning light, further intensifying the atmosphere of horror we found ourselves in. The medics jumped out of the vehicle, but judging by their faces, they already knew that help would be futile. This only confirmed the worst suspicions. The neighbor and all his guests had died under strange and inexplicable circumstances. The police began questioning me and the other residents. I tried to focus on their questions, but my gaze kept wandering around the yard, noting details I hadn't seen before. Everything around took on a strange, unnatural appearance. A sense of anxiety spread through my body like a cold wind. When I heard Donna Paloma say calmly, "They were very noisy," I involuntarily shuddered. Turning, I saw the police questioning the elderly lady who lived in the end apartment on the second floor. Her figure looked so weak and fragile against the backdrop of all this chaos that I felt a wave of pity. Donna Paloma had difficulty even hearing their questions, and it seemed she didn't understand why she had to answer them. I thought it was unnecessary cruelty to the old lady, who had always been safe and quiet. Her balcony was literally covered with blooming bougainvillea, so densely that she probably hadn't seen anything that happened that night. But something about all this left a bitter aftertaste in my soul. My mind refused to accept everything that was happening as a normal occurrence. The feeling that something more, something invisible, was behind these events continued to grow, ensnaring me in its web. After the questioning, I noticed Donna Paloma trying to climb the stairs again, swaying. Her movements were slow and uncertain, and I hurried to help her. She looked at me gratefully, and I gently took her arm, supporting her with each step. We walked silently through the dimly lit stairs, only the occasional creak of our steps breaking the silence. Donna Paloma seemed even smaller and more vulnerable than before. Her wrinkled face, usually calm, was now filled with confusion and anxiety. I led her to her apartment door, where she stopped and with a slight smile quietly thanked me. Her words sounded barely audible, like the whisper of the wind. She carefully opened the door and disappeared into the dark interior, leaving me on the stairs. I felt the echo of her voice mixed with my own inner turmoil. Inside, I was still boiling with unease that wouldn't let me rest. I went out onto the balcony and sat on an old plastic chair, trying to gather my thoughts. Below in the yard, the commotion continued. Police and medics, like faceless shadows, carried the bodies of strangers wrapped in gray sheets who would never wake up again. I looked at the remnants of the party that had seemed so lively just 2 hours ago, now turned into a scene from a horror movie. Empty bottles, cigarette butts, and scattered belongings on the ground heightened the sense of chaos that had taken over this place. But something else caught my attention. I suddenly realized that a strange smell surrounded me. Sweet, but with a bitter tang at the tip of my tongue. It enveloped me from all sides, filling my lungs and penetrating my consciousness. The smell seemed familiar yet foreign, as if mixed with something unusual. It was so strong that I felt a slight dizziness. My head seemed to grow heavier, my thoughts blurred, and the world around me became less clear. Maybe they had fallen victim to some forbidden substances, flashed through my mind. The thought sent a cold sweat down my spine, and my heart beat even faster. I rubbed the back of my head, trying to shake off this strange feeling. It was hard to focus, but I realized one thing. I definitely wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. The smell that enveloped me wouldn't let me rest. And the thought of what had happened that night haunted me like a shadow. So I slowly got up from the chair and swaying headed back to the apartment. I needed to distract myself somehow, to try to understand what had happened. But I felt that the answer, whatever it was, wouldn't bring me peace. A few days had passed since the mysterious deaths, but the weight of those events still hung in the air. People tried to return to their usual lives, pushing away thoughts of what had happened. However, each of us carried it in our hearts like an invisible burden from which there was no escape. So when a new family appeared in the yard, everyone welcomed them as a breath of fresh air. A young couple with twins, Anna and Gabriel, moved into the apartment where our late neighbor had lived. The family turned out to be pleasant and friendly, and their presence seemed to revive our yard. We were happy to have new acquaintances, and some even joked that these children would bring new life and help everyone forget the recent tragedies. No one dared to tell them about the terrible events, hoping they could start fresh. On my day off, I was helping Miguel, a neighbor and friend, repair his old car. It was a typical hot day, and we worked in the yard, sweating under the bright Mexican sun. Everything seemed normal, even pleasant. The yard was filled with life. Someone was hanging laundry on the balcony. Someone was washing the floor. Children were running around us, laughing and playing. But there was something inexplicable about this day, an indescribable feeling that everything around had frozen and fallen silent, as if the world beyond our little yard had ceased to exist. Anna and Gabriel, the twins of the new residents, were running around carefree, laughing loudly and tossing a ball to each other. Their cheerful voices seemed too bright, too contrasting against the backdrop of the gloom that still hung over us. And then something strange happened. Anna froze in place. Her ball slipped from her hands and rolled to my feet, stopping right in front of me. I bent down to pick it up when I suddenly saw the girl collapse to the ground. She began to shake, her body convulsing, and foam slowly started to come out of her mouth. I rushed to her, hearing a scream at the same moment. Turning my head, I saw that the same thing was happening to her brother Gabriel. A moment ago, they were laughing, and now their small bodies were fighting something invisible, something terrible. I tried to help Anna, trying to hold her head so she wouldn't hit it, but I couldn't do anything. Neighbors gathered around. Someone started doing the same with Gabriel. The children's mother screamed, her hands trembling as she tried to embrace her children but couldn't. Gabriella, one of the neighbors, tried to comfort her, hugging her, but she was just as scared as the rest of us. Even Donna Paloma, the elderly lady I always saw only in passing, stood on her balcony, watching what was happening. Suddenly, one of the neighbors began to pray loudly, uttering words with fear and hope, as if it could save the children. Others joined in, and the prayer spread through the yard like a wave, awakening some ancient fears and hopes in each of us. At the very moment when the last word of the prayer escaped our lips, the children's convulsions suddenly stopped. They lay motionless, but alive. We were all in shock, not understanding what had just happened. What was it? What helped? The prayers or the medical aid? No one knew, but the feeling of anxiety and fear only intensified. Horror completely engulfed me, leaving me powerless and helpless in the face of what had just happened. Anna's convulsions, her pale, almost waxen face, the foam gathering at her mouth. These images haunted me, etched into my consciousness. I tried to hold her, to prevent her from hitting herself, but I was powerless. Around me there were only cries and screams mixing with my own despair. When the convulsions finally stopped, I felt incredible relief, overshadowed by the realization of how close we had come to the irreparable. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were merely spectators in something much larger than we could imagine. When the children were finally taken to the hospital with their mother, we all remained in the yard, trying to comprehend what had happened. The silence was heavy, tense, as if we were afraid to break it and summon something even worse. Each of us sat quietly, lost in our thoughts, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened. But there was no logic in this explanation. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the voice of Maria, one of the most devout women in our yard. She looked at us with fear in her eyes and declared that dark forces had settled in our yard. They had first taken our neighbor and now had almost claimed the children. Her words pierced us, making us feel the horror and helplessness all over again. The neighbors picked up on this, starting to discuss theories, each adding something of their own, and together they tried to find answers to questions that had no simple answers. I sat apart, listening to them, but felt like a stranger in this place. My thoughts kept returning to the horrific image of Anna, almost lifeless, and each time this image surfaced in my mind, a new wave of terror washed over me. It was hard to breathe, hard to think, and I could barely hear what the neighbors were saying. I tried to focus, but it was in vain. At that moment, I missed the moment when the children's father, who had just arrived, began arguing with the neighbors. His face was contorted with anger, and I only noticed the altercation when he started shouting that we were all crazy, that it was our fault, and that they would move out because they didn't want anything to do with this apartment where someone had recently died. His emotions overwhelmed him, and I couldn't blame him. This apartment seemed to have become the center of something dark and sinister, and now it was slowly spreading throughout the yard, and so it happened. Just 2 days later, the family moved out, and it seemed that this event weighed heavily on each of us. Everyone who remained seemed afraid to leave their apartments, to cross paths with others. The yard became dead, silent, as if everyone was waiting for something even worse. But this waiting had no end. But soon something even more disturbing began to happen. At first, no one paid attention to the fact that objects began to disappear or end up in unusual places. The apartment keys, which always hung on the hook by the door, suddenly appeared in the hands of a neighbor. A flower pot that stood on the balcony somehow ended up at the other end of the yard, in a completely different place than usual. No one could explain this, but the tension began to grow. Gradually, paranoia took hold of us. Arguments began between neighbors. Everyone started suspecting each other of theft, and these suspicions led to real conflicts. Neighbors who had previously communicated peacefully now lashed out at each other with accusations. I couldn't help but feel how this atmosphere of discord was growing, as if an invisible hand was inciting us to mutual hatred. One day, when another argument reached its peak, Maria intervened. She stood in the middle of the yard and seemed to have a true revelation. Her words, filled with fear and determination, spread through us like the wind. She insisted that these were not simple thefts, but manifestations of dark forces that wanted to divide us, separate us from each other, and destroy us. Her theory instilled fear in those present, but at the same time it became the spark that reignited our desire to fight for our peace. It was after this that the idea of calling a priest began to circulate. It was like a healing that everyone subconsciously longed for, but no one dared to say out loud. Now that the idea was voiced, it gradually gained strength like a cloud before a storm. And with this hope, we waited for the moment when we could finally feel safe again, even if deep down we understood that it might already be too late. The priest appeared suddenly like a ghost the next day. I was returning from the store, trying not to think about what was happening in our yard, when I heard an incredible commotion. It came from there, as if someone was losing their mind. My heart clenched and I hurried home, hoping that this noise was not a harbinger of another disaster. When I entered the yard, I saw the priest standing in the middle, holding a cross in his hands. His face was serious, even stern. Next to him stood Maria, her devoutly clasped hands trembling with tension, but her voice did not falter. She was arguing with Juana, who, as far as I remembered, was a devoted follower of the Santa Muerte cult. Their argument was so loud it seemed to cut through the air. Maria shouted about the demonic forces surrounding us, insisting that only a Catholic priest could expel the evil from our yard. Juana, with an equally angry expression, claimed that Santa Muerte would protect them all, but they had to follow her rituals. I stood aside, slightly off balance from the conflict, when I noticed something strange happening with the weather. Just a few minutes ago, the sky was clear, but now the wind began to pick up, carrying heavy clouds that quickly filled the sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing in my chest, and shadows that had been hiding seemed to crawl out from every corner. It was a feeling hard to describe, as if nature itself was reacting to their quarrel, trying to warn us. I trembled with fear, watching as the two women continued to argue while the sky darkened above them. The wind howled like a raging beast, and I thought something was about to happen. But at that very moment, when Maria, gathering her courage, thrust forward the cross hanging around her neck, the argument suddenly ceased. Juana fell silent, her gaze filled with anger, but she relented. And in that second, as they calmed down, the wind began to die down. The thunder receded, and the darkness retreated as if nothing had happened. The priest sighed and, wasting no time, began the cleansing ritual. He sprinkled holy water around the yard, uttering words in Latin meant to purify the place from evil. I watched as the drops of holy water fell to the ground, as if trying to absorb something invisible, something that had settled here from the beginning. His voice droned on, pulling us into an abyss, and with each word my heart tightened more. I stood frozen, unable to move, feeling the cold creeping up my legs. It felt as if the ground beneath my feet was cracking, as if we were being pulled into another reality where only fear and despair reigned. I was terrified that we might never return to normal life, that the evil we felt would stay with us forever, leaving only empty, dead apartments around. The ritual ended, and for a moment it seemed to bring peace to the people around. Even Juana, who had been on the verge of exploding a minute ago, looked at the priest with a mix of disbelief and relief. Maria, as if shedding a huge burden, fell to her knees and, trembling, began to thank the priest for his help, tears streaming down her face. But I stood there, feeling the cold seeping under my skin, unable to shake the thought that this wasn't the end. Something inside me told me that it wouldn't end so easily. How could the evil that had caused such horrors retreat so easily? I looked at the others, who were already starting to disperse, slowly calming down, and realized that they seemed to feel relieved, but not me. My premonitions were confirmed sooner than I could have imagined. The priest, convinced that his work was done, headed to his car. His posture was confident, but anxiety grew in my heart. He got behind the wheel, and I was about to head home when I saw a thin stream of smoke begin to rise from under the car's hood. It seemed so unusual that I stopped involuntarily, and my heart began to race. The priest tried to start the car, but the engine was silent. The smoke grew thicker, and I noticed his expression change from confident to worried. He tried to open the door to get out, but it wouldn't budge. I could see a shadow of panic appear on his face. Something was holding him in the car, as if a trap had closed on him, and he was helpless. The smoke quickly filled the cabin, and in the next moment, flames engulfed the front of the car. The fire licked the hood, and I felt horror grip my heart. Without thinking, I rushed to the car along with several neighbors. They, like me, were gripped by fear and despair. We tried to open the doors, banging on the windows, shouting, but nothing worked. The priest inside began to thrash desperately, but nothing helped. Miguel, his face pale with horror, dashed to his car, grabbed a bat, and returned to the priest's car. He told the priest to cover himself before he started hitting the glass with all his might. I saw his hands tremble as he struck, trying to break the window, but the glass held firm, like a sinister guardian protecting the flames inside. The fire spread rapidly, engulfing the car as if devouring it. I felt waves of hot air scorching my skin, and my lungs constricted from the smoke and fear. The priest screamed, but his voice was quickly drowned out by the flames that now enveloped the entire vehicle. We were powerless. Our efforts seemed futile, and the evil we tried to expel had taken its toll. The glass finally gave way with a resounding crack that seemed to tear through the noise. Shards rained down on the priest, who, now covered in small cuts, let out muffled groans. Miguel and I grabbed him, our hands trembling with tension and fear, and with our last strength we pulled him from the car. The asphalt beneath us was so hot it felt like the ground was melting, but we were in a panic, focused only on dragging the priest away from the rapidly spreading fire. Our efforts were in vain. Our legs buckled and our minds couldn't process what was happening. I felt my mind refusing to believe this was reality. Each heartbeat was heavy and dull, echoing through my body like the final blows of a hammer sealing a death sentence. Finally, a neighbor helped us to our feet. I tried to stand, but the fear that gripped me to the bone paralyzed my body. And then the first explosion happened. Loud and deafening, it made us all recoil. The glass shattered, like fragile shells of life bursting, scattering shards in all directions. The car's tires burst one by one, and with each new explosion, I felt something inside me break, as if my body and mind couldn't withstand the pressure of this horror. The fire grew, consuming the car like a predator savoring its prey. The flames twisted and burned in the air, dancing in a cruel ritual, enveloping every inch of the vehicle. I stood motionless, paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from this infernal spectacle. It felt as if the fire was alive, with a consciousness, deliberately destroying everything in its path. My lungs filled with smoke, Each breath felt like hell, heavy, but I couldn't force myself to look away. The priest tried to say something, but his voice was lost in the roar of explosions and the roar of the fire. He was completely at the mercy of this nightmare. As were we all. This was more than just an accident. It was the embodiment of evil that had emerged from the shadows, showing that it hadn't disappeared but was waiting for its moment to strike again. Gabriella was shouting something into the phone, calling the firefighters, but it seemed futile. Juana, her face contorted, screamed something about the goddess bringing punishment, her voice filled with panic and hatred. And I stood there, feeling how this place and this moment separated me from reality. Everything around seemed unreal, like a terrible dream from which I couldn't wake up. I couldn't think, couldn't act. I just stood and watched as the car turned into a blazing ball of fire, as the evil we tried to expel returned, stronger and more ruthless than ever. After the priest's car turned into a blazing ball of fire, our yard changed. This place, which had once been ordinary, now became a battleground between forces beyond our understanding. The incident with the car not only frightened the residents, but also shattered their usual way of life, making them believe we were dealing with something much darker and more dangerous. With each passing day, religious differences among the neighbors grew sharper. Some decided that constant prayer was the only solution and created a makeshift altar where they lit candles and prayed to God for protection. Others, on the contrary, burned incense and smoked herbs, trying to drive out the evil spirits they believed had settled in our yard. It all resembled chaos, deepening fears and suspicions. I watched as our place, once a home, turned into an arena of clashes between different beliefs and practices. At night, the yard was filled with the light of candles and the smoke of incense, and the air was thick with fear and paranoia. Every sound seemed suspicious. Every shadow movement triggered a new wave of panic. It all became increasingly like a growing nightmare from which there was no waking up. The situation reached a critical point one morning when a neighbor's cat went missing. She couldn't find it in her apartment and began searching the yard in a panic. Her cries for help sparked a new wave of anxiety among the neighbors, and everyone joined the search. There was a sense in the air that this wasn't just the loss of a pet, but another sign that something was wrong, that the evil hadn't left us. But what one of Gabriella's sons said next brought even more terror. He claimed to have seen Juana, with a grim look and a bag in her hands, heading somewhere, and it seemed to him that something was moving inside the bag. It was unbelievable, yet terrifying, and all eyes instantly turned to Juana, who now looked even more suspicious. The cat owner's cries mixed with the neighbors' voices as they began discussing what to do. Fear quickly turned to outrage, and it became clear that action was needed immediately. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Juana might have decided to perform a ritual using the animal, and that she needed to be stopped before things got worse. The neighbors split into groups to search for Juana in different parts of the yard and building. I felt my fear turning into determination. We couldn't let this continue. Every second felt like an eternity. Every sound made my nerves tremble. The yard turned into a labyrinth of shadows and threats, where every step could lead to a new nightmare. Hours passed since the cat's disappearance, and our yard turned into a true arena of chaos. People hurled accusations at each other, and more often, eyes settled on Juana. Silent suspicions grew, and it became clear that we couldn't leave this unresolved. An invisible threat hung in the air, as if everything that was happening was part of something bigger, something we couldn't comprehend. Someone mentioned an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place rumored to be used for Santa Muerte rituals. This thought, so frightening and unnatural, immediately took hold of everyone. I didn't want to go there. Something inside me screamed that it was better to leave everything as it was. But when we realized that Juana had disappeared, fear and suspicion cornered me. We set out for the cemetery. The road there was long and eerie, passing through an abandoned wasteland. With each step, I felt everything around me becoming less real. Every sound seemed too loud, every shadow too long. When we finally reached the cemetery, I was gripped by a fear I had never known before. Before us lay a horrifying scene. Old graves, broken tombstones all overgrown with weeds, and amidst this desolation, a small altar lit by burning candles. I saw Juana. She stood by the altar, seemingly unaware of our presence. Her lips moved in silence, whispering something incomprehensible, and in her hands she held a bag with visible movements inside. I felt every cell in my body protesting, urging me to turn and run as far away as possible, but instead I took a step forward, another step. We knew we had to stop her, even if it meant facing something beyond our understanding. As we approached her, I saw in her eyes not just rage, but something more, as if fear itself was hiding in them. I grabbed the bag, yanking it from her hands. At that moment, time seemed to stop. Juana fell to the ground, and suddenly everything around became incredibly quiet. Even the wind stopped. The feeling of horror overwhelmed me as we rushed to her, pulling the bag from her hands and forcing her to stop the ritual. Juana tried to fight, screamed something meant to stop us, but it was too late. We returned from the cemetery, exhausted and speechless, as if after a hard battle. The cat, burdened with death and horror, was returned to its owner, who, barely holding back tears, took it home. Juana, also exhausted, silently went to her apartment. No arguments, no accusations, just a lingering, oppressive silence that weighed heavily on our chests. I entered my apartment without even taking off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed. Fatigue enveloped me like a blanket, but sleep wouldn't come. Thoughts swirled in my head, but my body refused to respond. Eventually, sleep overcame me, pulling me into the abyss of oblivion, where there was no place for fear or anxiety. But the peace didn't last long. I was awakened by a scream, a piercing, childlike scream that tore through the morning silence like a sharp knife. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The crowbar I always kept under my bed was in my hand before I even realized what I was doing. Running into the hallway, I saw Gabriella's son. He stood in the middle of the stairs, trembling all over, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't say a word, only his shaking hand pointed down to the yard. I approached the edge of the stairs and with horror looked down. The stone was stained with something dark and viscous, resembling blood. My mind refused to accept the reality unfolding before me. This was just the beginning. As the fog of sleep lifted, I saw the full picture. Blood splattered everywhere, staining the floor walls, and chicken carcasses lay scattered around. Their feathers stained, their limbs twisted and strange. They looked as if they had been brutally torn apart and left as a warning. Without thinking, I covered the boy's eyes, pressing him to me, and quickly led him to a neighbor who had come out at that moment. She, seeing us, turned pale and hurriedly took the boy inside. When I returned downstairs, the crowbar in my hand felt heavy, almost unbearable. My footsteps echoed through the empty yard, and every rustle caused panic. I carefully examined the area, feeling every nerve in my body tense to the limit. There was no one, just us in this horrific scene. Here's another thing I need to mention right now. We're at the midpoint of the story, and if you've listened up to this point, it means you're interested in what I'm doing. Please subscribe, like, and leave a comment longer than 5 words. It's crucial for YouTube to notice this video so I can keep bringing you new content. Thanks. You're a true friend. Suddenly, I noticed something on the walls. Handprints, strangely long and twisted, were higher than a person could reach. They seemed to be burned into the stone, leaving dark marks. It looked as if something had crawled along the walls, searching for an exit. The prints ended in the shadow cast by an old bush, and then a cold, paralyzing fear gripped me. It felt as if something invisible and sinister was watching me from that darkness. I felt its gaze on me, but saw nothing. Logic told me there was no one there, but my instincts screamed otherwise. It seemed that if I took a step closer, whatever was hiding in the shadows would pounce on me, destroying any chance of escape. Neighbors gathered from all sides, their steps determined but slow, as if they were afraid to find out what was happening. Their faces reflected a mix of fear and disgust as they saw the bloody scene. Despair and ignorance reigned in their eyes. Each of them realized that the situation was increasingly getting out of control, and in each of them grew the certainty that forces were at work here that they didn't understand and couldn't stop. Suddenly, Juana appeared before me. She looked as if she was being consumed by her own nightmares. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness, her face pale and exhausted, and every movement seemed cautious, as if she was afraid of invoking something upon herself. Her gaze was initially directed at me, but then suddenly shifted, stopping on something behind me. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, her face contorted with horror. She froze, her body trembling as if from a cold that pierced her bones. Slowly, as if under some invisible weight, she began to kneel, her fingers nervously sliding over the stone, leaving bloody streaks. She crawled backward, not taking her eyes off the same point behind me, her lips moving, uttering incomprehensible prayers. Every movement was filled with a despair, and with each step the fear in my heart grew. Her blood mixed with the existing blood on the stone, forming a terrifying red-black pattern that seemed to pulse like it was alive. I stood silently, watching what was happening, feeling something deep and dark tearing inside me. My thoughts blurred like in a fog, but one thought pounded in my head. Something terrible had settled in this yard, and this something wasn't just watching us. It was already touching each of us, leaving marks in our consciousness, making us see and feel what couldn't be explained. Juana grabbed Miguel's leg, her fingers clenching around his ankle, leaving red streaks on his skin. Her voice, once loud and confident, now sounded barely audible, her pleas turning into sobs. She prayed to be taken away from here, far from this place, which she believed had become a repository of evil. Her tears mixed with the blood on her face. She felt no pain, only a panicked fear of the unknown. And then I realized that even I, once skeptical and rational, had begun to believe that something invisible, dark, and terrible had settled in our yard. This was not just a disaster, it was something much worse, something that wanted not just to destroy us, but to leave us in eternal fear of the unknown. And this something had already begun its inexorable path. There was no point in calling the police. That was the consensus among those who still had some strength and sanity left in the courtyard. The mere thought of explaining the horrors of this night to outsiders seemed absurd. Miguel took it upon himself to escort Juana home. She walked unsteadily, as if teetering between sleep and nightmare, while Miguel silently supported her, trying to offer some comfort. Their figures disappeared around the corner of the building, leaving the other residents alone with the eerie silence of the courtyard. Left to ourselves, we, the silent witnesses of what had transpired, began to clean the courtyard. This was no ordinary cleaning where you simply try to tidy up. No, this was something different, something desperate and almost ritualistic. The stones were stained with blood that seemed to have seeped into them, as if fused with the very courtyard. Every movement, every sound was muffled by the heavy silence that hung over us like a cloud, ready to burst at any moment. But even in this silence, there was something more terrifying than the sight of the horror before us. It was the feeling that something or someone was watching us. I wasn't the only one who felt this gaze. It hung in the air, almost palpable on the skin. Each neighbor would occasionally turn around, as if trying to catch whoever was standing behind them. They quickly turned their heads, fearfully scanning the area, but saw nothing. Yet this nothing was the most frightening. It seemed alive and omnipresent. Old Paloma, who always sat in her corner, was now in plain sight. The neighbors decided to bring her out into the courtyard and keep her close to protect her from potential dangers. She sat on her stool, clutching her prayer beads, quietly whispering words that had probably long lost their meaning to her. We all sat in the center of the courtyard, huddled together, as if this could protect us from the invisible threat. I looked at my hands, which I had recently washed of blood, but even clean, they seemed stained to me. The red tint did not fade from memory, and the smell of blood, metallic and suffocating, seemed part of the stone, part of the courtyard itself. My head hung heavily, and my eyes focused on the cracks in the stone, where traces of the night's horror still glistened. Each of these cracks seemed to me a door to the abyss, from which evil crawled out. I don't know how long we sat like that, united by a common horror. Hours blended into one endless moment when suddenly Miguel broke the silence. He stood, nervously fidgeting with his hands, and his face showed both despair and determination. He said that this couldn't go on any longer, that we needed to find a way out of this nightmare. His words sounded like a thunderclap in the dead silence, and although no one reacted immediately, it was clear that everyone agreed with him. We all understood that we were standing on the edge of an abyss, and the next step could be our last. Miguel gathered us all in the center of the courtyard, his voice quiet but full of determination. He suggested listening to Juana, who held a small bag in her hands, as if it were our last hope. I saw her trembling, but her gaze was focused. We gathered around her, forming a small circle. Even the most skeptical among us were silent. Their faces reflected only despair and a willingness to do anything to end the horror that had engulfed our courtyard. Juana took a deep breath, her voice trembling, but she spoke confidently. She told us about an ancient ritual that, according to her, could protect us and drive out the evil that seemed to have settled here. I listened to her, and with each word I felt fear gripping me more and more. But at the same time, I realized that we had no other choice. This was our last chance, our last hope. I looked at the faces of the neighbors. No one objected, no one doubted. We were all so scared that we were ready to try anything. So we dispersed to our apartments to gather things that could help in the ritual. I took a small wooden cross that always hung above the door. Others returned with crosses, amulets, small icons, statues of saints, prayer books. In the center of the courtyard, we placed a large candle, a symbol of our collective strength. Its flame flickered in the wind but did not go out, as if showing that we were still holding on. We stood around the candle, forming a circle. I felt that this unity, though born of fear, gave us a measure of strength. We were less defenseless in the face of the unknown horror that haunted us. I stood in the circle, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. Looking at my hands, they were clean, but it seemed to me that there were still traces of blood on them. The metallic smell that had seeped into the stone seemed more and more tangible. I could barely breathe from the tension. Each of us whispered prayers, asking for protection. I heard Juana begin her ritual. She took herbs and salt from her bag, sprinkling them around the candle. creating a barrier. Then she took a knife and made a cut on each of our fingers, letting the blood fall to the ground. I watched this, and my insides churned with horror, but I couldn't look away. The candle in the center suddenly flared up stronger, as if fighting an invisible wind trying to extinguish it. I noticed the neighbors' faces tense, each glancing at the others, but no one dared to break the ominous silence. It was getting darker around us, the sky quickly covered with heavy black clouds, and it seemed that a storm was ready to break upon us. Suddenly, the air became thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pressing on our chests, making it hard to breathe. Juana seemed unaware of this, her eyes burning with a fanatical gleam, and she raised her hands to the sky, loudly calling on the forces to help her. Her words were filled with despair and faith, as if this was our last hope for salvation. The wind howled stronger, and the first drops of rain fell heavily to the ground, shattering on the stone. Every sound seemed amplified in this eerie silence. I felt fear gripping my heart, each clap of thunder making me flinch. The clouds that covered the sky descended lower, as if trying to engulf us along with our despair. At some point, as Juana uttered the final words of the incantation, a powerful rumble suddenly echoed around us. It wasn't just thunder. It sounded as if a deep, rolling scream burst from the sky, piercing the veil between worlds. It was the scream of something inhuman, terrifying, that made the hair on my head stand on end. It seemed that nature itself was rebelling against what we were trying to do. I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead. Something incomprehensible, invisible, but immensely powerful was nearby, and we all felt it. Suddenly, the silence became so deep that it seemed the courtyard itself held its breath. I stood, holding my breath, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, and one question echoed in my mind. Would this work? The candle flame no longer flickered. It burned steadily, but I still felt a deep anxiety. We stood in anticipation, afraid to even move, as if something invisible held us in this circle. No one knew what would happen next. I looked at the faces of the neighbors, saw the same fear in their eyes that I felt myself. Juana stood with a composed expression, but I saw her hands trembling, and all that was left was to wait, hoping that we had done everything right, that this ritual, this unity, would give us some chance of survival in this place where evil lurked, waiting for its moment to strike the final blow. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a strange but pleasant feeling of relief, as if an incredible burden had been lifted from my shoulders. This feeling was like a long-awaited breath of fresh air after being underwater for too long. At first, I couldn't believe it. So unexpected it was, but it was real. My muscles, which had been trembling with tension, began to relax, and a deep, relieved sigh escaped my chest. I felt weak, as if I had just woken from a terrible dream, and my strength, all this gathered and accumulated tension inside, simply dissolved. I looked around and saw that I wasn't the only one who felt this relief. The neighbors, though looking extremely exhausted, shared the same feeling with me. Gabriella was supporting old Paloma, who could barely stand, but shadows of smiles appeared on their faces, the first in all this horrific time. Juana, who was still standing with her hands raised, lowered them, and her lips stretched into a smile that mingled with an expression of almost childlike joy. Everyone began to smile, their eyes filled with the hope we had long sought. It seemed the ordeal was over, the darkness had retreated, and we had triumphed. People hugged, sighed with relief. Some even began to laugh quietly, both from relief and exhaustion. The storm slowly subsided, the rain became less intense, and the thunder now rumbled far away, as if that terrible scream had retreated with it. But the joy was tense, as if its thin edge could snap at the slightest sound. And as I watched the joyful faces of the neighbors, a new feeling sprouted within me, a small seed of doubt. Was this really over? Had we truly banished the dark force, or was this just a temporary lull before a new strike? A quiet, barely noticeable whisper of doubt pierced my thoughts. All these rituals, all these incantations, perhaps we had only touched something deeper, something we couldn't even comprehend. The joy, though genuine, already seemed a bit premature. I felt it in every cell of my body. In their joy, everyone decided to celebrate the event. The idea seemed wonderful to everyone, as if it was the perfect ending to a horrific story that had dragged on too long. In the morning, as I was getting ready for work, a light smile played on my face. Gabriella's children were drawing a poster for the party, and other neighbors were bustling around, decorating the courtyard and preparing treats. It was to be a grand celebration, one that everyone had been eagerly awaiting. Finally, it seemed as if the sun was beginning to break through the thick clouds. However, all day at work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something small, elusive, like a slight chill, ran down my skin, and this inexplicable anxiety wouldn't let me rest. Despite the general uplift, a feeling had taken root deep inside that we might have celebrated victory too soon. When the workday ended, I hurried home, having stayed a bit late. From afar, I heard music coming from the courtyard. My smile returned as it seemed a sign that everything was fine. Quickly grabbing the bag with the ordered snacks, I approached the gate and, pushing it open, entered the courtyard. My gaze froze and cold fear pierced my entire body, paralyzing every movement. The bag slipped from my hands, falling dully onto the stone floor, scattering the ordered snacks, but it seemed so insignificant, trivial against the backdrop of what lay before me. All my neighbors lay motionless on the cold stone, their bodies twisted in incredibly horrific poses, frozen in a moment of unspeakable suffering. Their faces, they were pale, almost deathly white, each feature frozen in agony, as if their skin had blackened from the horror that consumed them from within. Their eyes, widened in final despair, looked dead, but their empty gazes still seemed to radiate what they had seen before death. Their lips were twisted as if in a scream that was never heard. Unspeakable pain and horror were etched on their faces, like the imprint of some invisible force that had torn the last breath of life from them. It all looked absurd and eerie against the backdrop of festive decorations that pointlessly illuminated their dead bodies, and the dance music that continued to play as if nothing had happened. The sounds of the cheerful melody blended with the silence that filled the courtyard, turning the whole scene into a sinister farce. Around were scattered streamers, colorful balloons, garlands, all now part of the horrific spectacle that unfolded before me, and each piece of decor only emphasized the grotesque hopelessness of the situation, creating a contrast between the celebration that was supposed to happen and the tragedy that replaced it. And then my gaze fixed on the center of this horror. Amidst all this dreadful scene stood old Paloma. Her gentle yet terrifying smile was directed straight at me, as if she was waiting for me to join this horrific finale. Behind her, on the wall of the house, a huge, almost unreal shadow was clearly visible, sending shivers down my spine. It wasn't just a shadow. Its contours, though blurred, carried something incredibly frightening, something inexplicable, something that made my heart beat wildly. Paloma looked at me with that same crazed smile, extending her hands towards me like a mother inviting a child into her embrace. And suddenly, as if through the noise in my own head, I heard her calmly say, "They were too noisy." Those words, simple and almost mundane, struck me like a lightning bolt to the heart. My mind began to unravel the events that had seemed chaotic, but now everything fell into place. Memories whirled through my head, showing me how everyone who dared to disturb the silence and peace of this courtyard ended up on the brink of death or in terrible agony. At first, I saw only a strange coincidence, but now I felt that this connection was obvious, even horrifyingly inevitable. It was all about her, old Paloma, who always seemed so innocent, quiet, almost unperturbed. She was always on the sidelines, watching with cold calmness what was happening around. Her presence seemed insignificant, but she was omnipresent, an invisible thread that tied all the horrors of this place together. I recalled her reaction to each tragedy, and my heart clenched with realization. Her gaze never changed, and there was always a slight, barely noticeable smile on her face, which now seemed eerie to me. I always felt that something was wrong with her, but I could never imagine that this frail, hunched figure hid such a dark power. She seemed to be the spirit of this courtyard, an invisible arbiter who punished any disturbance of the silence. My heart pounded in my chest, as if trying to break free, when I realized that she, Paloma, was the invisible executioner who had led everyone to this terrible fate. Her hands seemed soaked in blood, but not literally. It was a feeling as if all of her entire essence was immersed in this ruthless, invisible force. Were all these misfortunes, all these terrible events her doing? And if so, what was she really? With each new realization, I was gripped by more and more horror. She didn't just watch. She controlled, she punished, she judged, and those who dared to interfere in her quiet world became victims of this invisible but ruthless justice. My soul shuddered, realizing that this old, frail woman was the embodiment of all the evil that hung over our courtyard, and that she did it with cold, unflinching calmness, as if it was meant to be. My thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the loud wail of police sirens. I turned and saw the flashing lights of their beacons reflecting off the walls of the house. This light, which at any other moment would have seemed annoying, now looked almost salvific in this nightmarish situation. At first, they headed towards me, but their gazes stopped on Paloma. The police officers exchanged nervous glances as if sensing something wrong. One of them began to cautiously approach the old woman, holding a taser in his hands. Paloma stood motionless, her figure seeming frail and defenseless, but there was something dark and sinister gleaming in her eyes. The officer paused for a moment, as if weighing all possible consequences, and when he got close enough, he quickly used the taser. The old woman screamed sharply in pain, and this piercing scream cut through the air, making everyone around freeze. But it wasn't just her scream. Following it came a loud, inhuman roar that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It pierced the night, making everything around shudder. I stood paralyzed with fear, watching Paloma's body fall to the ground, and the huge black shadow that had grown behind her slowly dissolve into the night shadows. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something that shouldn't exist in this world. A feeling of unusual cold passed over my skin, and I realized that only now had this terrible nightmare finally ended. I was taken to the police station for questioning. I sat in front of the officers trying to tell them everything I had seen, but each word came with difficulty. Each mention of the neighbors, their faces now frozen in horrific grimaces, made me fall silent. I barely held back tears, trying not to break down right there in that sterile office. The police listened to me with disbelief, and I saw that they didn't want to believe this story, which seemed too horrific to be true. In the end, they decided to chalk it up to another gang clash, and they let me go home. I left the station and walked back to my courtyard, but this courtyard, which once seemed familiar to me, now felt alien, soaked with memories of the horrors that had occurred here. I looked at it all as if with foreign eyes and realized that I couldn't stay here. The decision came quickly. I went up to my place, gathered the essentials, and within an hour I was sitting on a bus taking me far from this place. I wanted to leave Mexico forever, to forget those terrible events, to leave them behind like a bad dream. But deep inside, I knew that these memories would haunt me forever. Nothing could erase them from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see those bodies, feel as if Paloma's shadow still pursued me, no matter where I was. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist. An oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.